Okay, so we're on page 5, the second slide, and we have a picture of the female reproductive anatomy, I guess. And so you see sort of what looks like two horns out to the side, and we have the ovaries on either side. So hopefully you're seeing that picture. It's this picture right here. So out to the sides here and here, what we see are the ovaries. And I said, under the influence of luteinizing hormone, we ovulated the egg. The egg comes out. Comes out. Where does it go? Well, it ends up, you see there's those tubes, and it's like, you have the ovary, and surrounding it, you have the end of the ovarian tube, or it's also known as the fallopian tube. I forgot for a second, the fallopian tubes. And so the egg, when it comes out, when it is ovulated under the influence of luteinizing hormone, it enters into this bell-shaped structure at the end of the uterine tube, the fallopian tube, and it makes its way towards the uterus. And it'll take a day or so, a few days, for it to make it to the uterus. Now, remember that guy, the male, and we had said internal fertilization, so semen was deposited at the top of the vagina below the uterus. So you can see, looking at our picture again, you can see at the bottom of the uterus, there's something called a cervix. And the cervix can either be open or closed. And when it's time for ovulation, the cervix is open. And so during this period of time, if the semen is deposited right there, then it makes its way up through the uterus and into those fallopian tubes. And so it has, we said it is in a fluid that cares for and keeps the little guys, the little sperm cells, moving right along. And maybe they're going to meet up with the ovum that has been ovulated. And if they do, for them to be successful, it will be in the fallopian tubes. So the site of fertilization which will result in the production of an embryo and a fetus, will be in the fallopian tubes. Now, if it's not in the fallopian tubes, what happens is it ends up not resulting in a pregnancy. So the fallopian tubes are a path for the ovum to make its way to the uterus and the site of fertilization. What then happens is so we had said that you have this lining in the uterus that has been developing under the influence of the estrogen and the progesterone. So in addition to stimulating the release of the luteinizing hormone, the estrogen is also having an effect on the uterus. And the effect has been to get the uterus ready. Maybe we're going to have a baby. And so it starts developing a lining there. And then after ovulation, we had said we have the corpus luteum. We had said that follicle becomes a new name called the corpus luteum. And it starts to produce not estrogen, but progesterone. And progesterone is the hormone of pregnancy. And so the hormone of pregnancy, what does it do? It keeps the woman from losing the lining. So it doesn't do any good if you fertilize the egg and it makes its way down to the uterus if you then lose the lining. And this actually is what happens oftentimes when women have a miscarriage. So what happens is the egg makes its way into the uterus, and it implants in that lining. And the connection between the embryo and the mama is called the placenta. And so this little connection between the little guy and mom, the placenta, it sends a signal to the corpus luteum and it says, hey, 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 we're pregnant. Just keep making that progesterone. And so what'll happen is as the embryo is developing, the corpus luteum will continue producing progesterone, the hormone of pregnancy, for 3 months. Okay, now, wait 1 minute, wait 1 second here. 3 months, it takes 9 months for a baby to develop, right? Well, what happens is after those first 3 months, remember that placenta, the connection between the baby and the mama? It starts to produce progesterone. Now, and so that keeps, so when the corpus luteum finally stops producing progesterone after about 3 months, at that point, the placenta is making enough that you don't lose the uterine lining. I just said sometimes loss of progesterone is responsible for miscarriages. Both of my sisters had miscarriages 3 months after pregnancy because the placenta wasn't making enough progesterone. And so when the corpus luteum stopped, they lost the baby. And so it's a time when a woman has to worry about losing a baby, that 3-month transition. Okay, let me make sure that I've covered everything I want to cover in this part. We had said the oviducts, the uterine tubes, fallopian tubes. Oh my gosh, there's so many names for the same thing. Okay, so an oviduct is the same thing as a uterine tube and the fallopian tube. I didn't use the term oviduct before, but they're all synonyms, sorry. And if we're looking at what it says the egg travels through this tube. The tube is lined with cilia, and so they produce a current, a fluid current, and that's how the egg gets to the uterus. And at the bottom it says, this is where fertilization occurs. The lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. So on the final slide on the 5th page of this of the slides, so that would be the 20th slide, I guess. Yeah. On that slide, it says endometrium, and that's the uterine lining. And it lines the uterus, and it thickens each month in preparation for a potential pregnancy. And then, if you didn't get pregnant, what happens? Women go through this process of losing the lining. Now, that lining, it's got some pretty good stuff in there. It's got all kinds of nutrients, blood vessels. It's a great place for the baby to grow up, to develop. It's a wonderful place, but it's also a good place for bacteria. Now what happens is, so we had said the cervix has to be open to allow the semen in, and so through the vagina there's microbes that can get in there, and they do. And they can cause a uterine infection, but what happens? Well, once a month, you get rid of all of that stuff, and so any of those microbes that have made their way in there, they're lost. And so that's why women go through this process called menstruation. And what happens, just to finish my story about the cervix, after you're pregnant, that cervix closes up. And so it's sealed off. The baby is separated from the outside by a mucus plug that forms there. And then, of course, before the baby is born, that mucus plug is lost. Okay, so we are looking at page 6, and we had said estrogen and progesterone. These are hormones that are made by the ovary. We had said the developing follicle produces estrogen. The ovulated follicle, the one that has released its egg, produces progesterone. And we had said that the hormone that resulted in ovulation, the release of the ovum, the mature egg, was called the luteinizing hormone. And so we can look at a slide which is showing, the next slide is showing the on average, what we call the ovarian cycle is a 28-day process. Now I know it varies from person to person, but on average. And so we look at what's going on. And so if you look at this slide right here, you can see some graphs. And the top graph is showing estrogen rising. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see estrogen is peaking at about day 12 or 13. Now, that rise in estrogen is what caused your brain, the pituitary gland, to release luteinizing hormone. And so we had said, so luteinizing hormone is what we said causes ovulation. So the egg is released, and then the second half of the time period, you can see we have progesterone that's being produced. And we'd said, what's producing it? Oh yeah, it is that corpus luteum, the spent follicle, the follicle that has released its egg. And so then we have all of this stuff. We have a really complicated picture here that sort of is showing all of this stuff. That's an ovary there. And the idea is, if you look at it, it's showing what's going on at the various days. And so you can see it starting here and working around to ovulation, and then corpus luteum producing the progesterone, and it represents that whole 28-day period. Sort of positioned next to it, we also have menstruation represented by the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. And so we had said that lining thickens under the influence of estrogen and progesterone. And then what happened? Okay, so we'll say one sort of final thought to ponder is, we had said throughout that whole period of time you were producing the egg, and the follicle was getting bigger and bigger. You were producing estrogen, and then the corpus luteum produced progesterone, and then it stopped. And say you're not pregnant. All of a sudden, you have very low sex hormones. And what does that do? This is what triggers this loss of the lining and the menstruation process. And then it all starts all over again. And just so women, they go on a hormonal roller coaster ride, to be quite honest. And so there's this thing called PMS, premenstrual syndrome, right? And it is directly related to, you went from this period where you have all of these really good, feel-good hormones, motherly kind of stuff, estrogen, female characteristics, down to nothing. And then it starts again. And so that sort of explains all of that. All right, so on Thursday, we're going to be meeting, and we're going to be talking about the other half of the story, right? What happens from here? How does the baby form from this single egg? Sounds exciting. I'll talk to you then. You guys have a good day.